Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we're currently looking at is The Dawn of Everything by the Davids Graeber and Wengrow. And this is a really epic book, and I'm going to look at it over three films. The first two dealing with its ideas, respectively called History and Politics, and the final one devoted to an evaluation of those ideas. So, beginning with the first of these, today's film History, this has three parts, which I've called Manifesto, Indigenous Critique, and History over Myth. And kicking off with the first of these, Manifesto, I've called it this because The Dawn of Everything is not just a major contribution to the understanding of our deep past, and it's certainly that, but it's also, in its ambition and its scale, its vision and style, a manifesto to, in their words, approach our human past with fresh eyes and tell a more hopeful and interesting story. And it's a story which they claim is built upon the latest science to produce a new evidence-based account of how human societies have developed over the last 30,000 years, which they argue will present a new vision of mankind and invite readers into a new science of history. So this then is its manifesto, and I think it's one that's committed to three principal tasks. The first is to dismantle the prevailing wisdom about our deep past. The second, to go beyond what they call wrong questions and dead-end debates. And the last one, to give our species its due. As for the first of these, the prevailing wisdom of our deep past, well, this for Graeber and Wengrow is really no more than a set of assumptions which are now wholly at odds with historical evidence. That we, as a species, spent 95% of our history living in small groups and are not really designed cognitively for large-scale living. That human societies could be arranged according to stages of development, each with its own technology and forms of organisation, becoming progressively more complex and more sophisticated with each stage. That technology has moved human society through a progressive sequence of bands, tribes, chieftains, and finally states, and that this whole journey, and in many ways the very idea of history itself, begins with agriculture as the original and inescapable force of human development, upon whose surpluses cities and ultimately civilizations would be founded. So these are some of the many assumptions that this book sets out to refute. And built upon all of these, Graeber and Wengrow see another kind of mistake in the form of a very long and for them futile argument about the nature and cause of inequality, organised around the competing 17th century philosophies of Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with Rousseau arguing on one side that our embrace of agriculture was humankind's greatest mistake, when free, equal and happy humanity was abruptly expelled from the Garden of Eden into a world of property, pride and inequality, lured by false promises for greater freedom, but which ultimately had us running to our chains. And on the other side, Hobbes and all of his successors, right up to the present day, arguing that the hierarchy that came with agriculture was necessary for the collective repression of our baser instincts, and because, in the words of Jared Diamond, large populations can't function without leaders who make decisions, executives who carry them out, and bureaucrats who administer them. So that, as prevailing wisdom has it, humanity has been on a great and seemingly predestined journey to ever greater scale, complexity, and ultimately hierarchy, with inequality the worthwhile and very necessary price for writing and science and philosophy and the nation state, that is to say, all that can be understood by the idea of civilization. But the problem with all of this is that it's simply not true. Not one of these arguments, Graeber and Wengrow tell us, square with archaeological evidence, and all lack any basis in human psychology, telling us that the evidence now available demonstrates that agriculture was far from inevitable or the historical mistake that would bring hierarchy into the world forever. That complex systems don't have to be organised top-down. That humanity has from the beginning a capacity to live simultaneously with a small number of people who are known to them, and thousands, potentially millions of others, all connected by imaginary structures of belief. And perhaps most importantly of all, that the deep history now emerging as a consequence of all of this research is not one of kings and hierarchy, but civic experiments on a grand scale, where our forebears playfully tried out multiple ways of living, and where hierarchy and authoritarian rule was frequently nowhere to be seen. All of which, for Graeber and Wengrow, render existing social theory largely a game of make-believe, reducing people to cardboard stereotypes and crudely simplifying our overwhelmingly rich and profoundly diverse social history. And it's with this in mind that the Davids are particularly scathing about the current purveyors of big picture history, targeting in particular Jared Diamond, Francis Fukuyama, Noah Harari and Steven Pinker, who, in the eyes of Graeber and Wengrow, do no more than offer reheated Rousseauian tales of our expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and whose arguments, despite their self-assured tone, lack any real scientific evidence, almost as if they say they're afraid to suggest anything original. So that a big part of their manifesto is an appeal to ask better questions and go beyond what they call dead-end debates. And in particular, they hope to demonstrate, in what I think is a very bold argument, that inequality is in fact a distraction for progressive thought, conceptually problematic, and for them, premised on some kind of nostalgia for a mythical past of small egalitarian bands, hoping, in the words of Joni Mitchell, to go back to the garden. But for the Davids, what has been lost, and what might redeem us, is not equality, but freedom. And that's because freedom, that is to say, our capacity for self-creation, is precisely what they see in our deep history, and which also reveals freedom as often the most effective means through which human solidarity can be realised, such that our future, they argue, now hinges on our capacity to rediscover freedoms that we once had but have now lost. The freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey orders, and the freedom to create new human relationships and communities, all of which are key, they say, to understanding our past and reclaiming our future. And in many ways, it's this straitjacket of fixed ideas about the past and its people that keeps us stuck in all of this, as well as doing a big disservice to our species, presenting it as less thoughtful, less creative, and less free than we turn out to have been, especially dismissing pre-modern people as a sort of primordial human soup made up of primitives living aimlessly in a mythological dream world, at best mindlessly bound to the shackles of tradition, at worst wholly incapable of critical thought. And in this regard, while Graeber and Wengrow are really scathing to what they see as the smug arrogance of those big history theorists so dismissive of humanity, perhaps their greatest manifesto commitment is to give our species its due. courtesy of new science and new multidisciplined research findings, where again a whole new picture is now emerging, where many pre-modern people are now recognised as imaginative, intelligent, playful and politically mature, self-conscious political actors capable of embracing an array of social arrangements, making bold experiments and frequently and consciously arranging society to prevent the rise of hierarchy and the abuse of power. So this then is their manifesto, to dismantle the prevailing wisdom about our deep past, to go beyond wrong questions and dead-end debates, and to give our species its due. And the consummate illustration of all of this, which brings us to part 2, is the indigenous people of Northeast America in the centuries prior to the European invasion. So much so that Graeber and Wengrow begin and end their book with their history, society and culture. And that's both because their ways of living exemplify pretty much all the arguments that Graeber and Wengrow want to make about diverse human possibility, but also to reveal the penetrating power of what came to be known as the Indigenous critique of 17th century European culture, a critique which was made at a very particular moment in our history when we, that is to say Europe, were on the very cusp of becoming the world's greatest power. And this little known but quite extraordinary moment in our history cannot be fully comprehended without a deeper sense of theirs, which is to say, to understand the Indigenous critique of us, we need to know the history of the people making it, which for nearly 2,000 years before the Europeans arrived, was engaged in its own epic struggle between freedom and servitude, and which produced a remarkable political culture, from which came not only a damning critique of European social life, but which was also a profound influence on the European Enlightenment. And to help us properly understand this, Graeber and Wengrow set out the history of the North American indigenous, a history with the struggle for freedom at its very centre in 3 broad periods. The first of these was the period of the Hopewell interaction sphere, where between 100 BC and AD 500, the indigenous people of North America established a clan-based network across the whole Mississippi River system, connecting virtually all parts of North America, so that a traveller from the bear or the wolf or the hawk clan would always find someone obliged to host them across the whole continent. And with this simple freedom to move, and of course to be welcomed somewhere else, a wider social and political freedom was inscribed in this first of these 3 periods, in a culture that seems almost designed to maximise the capacity to move and reshuffle social arrangements. And despite the mobility of its population, it was also a culture of scale and complexity, all realised without elites, where its many societies were built around gigantic earthworks, often miles across, planned in advance, premised on remarkably accurate systems of measurement and marshalling enormous amounts of labour, all of which provides us with the first of many refutations of that orthodox story of pre-modern simplicity. The second phase of this history begins around the 9th century, by which time this Hopewell culture of freedom begins to give way to a great city called Cahokia. And the birth of this city marks a fateful turn towards servitude across the whole of the North American continent. The city itself was built and designed to a master plan of totalitarian ambition, with populations forcibly dispersed, surveillance architecture and mass executions. But then this second period, this period of servitude, begins its own decline from the 11th and 12th centuries onwards, as numerous Cahokia-style imitator cities emerge, compete, and enter into a long process of war and destruction, until finally, by AD 1400, Cahokia and all its wannabe petty kingdoms begins to empty out, with people moving to freer lives in a process of mass defection that Graeber and Wengrow describe as the self-conscious rejection of everything that Cahokia stood for. And here the Davids tell us, for the descendants of Cahokia, this migration becomes a template for future political transformation, where the ability to relocate was in effect a restructuring of their entire social order, built primarily on their freedom to move, but flowing from that the freedom to disobey and to build new social worlds, in a process of political renewal that became fully familiar to the indigenous people of North America. It's what they called moving to a new country, their description for what we would call constitutional change. And with their former Cahokia-style dictators now gone, from the 15th century, the people of the Mississippi began to descend back into the valleys, beginning the third and final period, a period of reclaimed freedom to produce the social and political world of Candiarunk, who, of course, is the great hero of this book. Courageous warrior, brilliant orator, skillful politician, key strategist for the Wendat Confederacy of the Iroquois, and voice of the Indigenous critique. And the world he's going to come from is a world of small towns governed by community councils of equality and consensus. It's a place where women held key political roles and men spent much of the day, they say, smoking tobacco and drinking caffeinated beverages, arguing about politics and engaging in sophisticated and rational debate. And it's a place where one of its many societies, the Osage, continuously and systematically applied philosophical speculation to the political issues of the day, and who saw in their long history of struggle, political experiment and moving to another country, a science of institutional politics whose ideas would later be made famous by the European philosopher Montesquieu. This, then, is the deep soil from which the Indigenous critique would emerge from the rich history of struggle and experiment, whereby Conderonk and the Indigenous people of North America were heirs to a long intellectual and political history, long before their encounter with the Europeans, with a culture the product of centuries of political conflict and self-conscious debate, in which the capacity to engage in political thought and language was considered one of the highest human values, and which became their platform for their 18th century encounter with French traders, officials and Jesuits, conducted over a long series of philosophical debates, arguing over the nature of freedom and rationality and revealed religion, and where the Indigenous picked apart Christian doctrines, the European style of punitive law, and the French legal system, all of which crystallised into their own highly consistent critique of European institutions. And of course, this was a critique premised on their own traditions of freedom, the rejection of arbitrary power, mutual aid and political autonomy, whereby they considered themselves better and richer than the French, whom they considered envious, dishonest, aggressive, neither generous or kind, and in their blind submission to authority, little more than slaves in a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all. And all of these discussions and debates were detailed in extensive Jesuit records, best-selling missionary and travel literature, wildly popular and long-running theatre productions, and translated into multiple languages, massively impacting on European sensibilities and profoundly influencing its thinkers. And just as the Osage political philosophy was appropriated to become Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, so the arguments of the Indigenous critique and the possibilities for human emancipation that these demonstrated, they became the conceptual and thematic basis of the European Enlightenment. But if it was in this way to inspire, it was also a critique so powerful that it was perceived as a direct threat to European culture and society, so that European intellectuals, as well as appropriating indigenous arguments, responded with the creation of our old friend, the evolutionary and staged model of history, whereby human societies could be arranged according to stages of development, each becoming progressively more complex, sophisticated, and advanced. And of course, this proved a brilliant device to relegate the indigenous to an earlier and therefore inferior stage in the evolution of human society, and thereby silencing and discrediting the indigenous critique in what Graeber and Wengrow tell us was an enormous effort to salvage a sense of European superiority. But now, in the hands of Graeber and Wengrow, the indigenous critique is once again returned to its power as both cause and refutation, not just of the stage theory of history, but pretty much all the prevailing wisdom about our deep past. And having dispensed with this, revealing it not as history but as mythology, Graeber and Wengrow go on to offer their new and alternative history, premised on, in their words, treating people as imaginative, intelligent and playful creatures, constantly experimenting, and in ways that have produced stunning diversity in how to live and how we have lived, beyond not just the dreams but the intellectual reach of orthodox thinking. And in this spirit, they embark on an epic survey, bringing us to the third and final section, a survey of new evidence and old social anthropology, used both as a continuous refutation of the old story, but also to lay down some early markers for an alternative theory of our development, which in this final section I've sought to summarise under the headings Ice Age Monumental Architecture, Play Farmers and Lost Cities of the Neolithic, and finally Schismogenesis and Seasonality. So, beginning this final section with the monumental architecture of the Ice Age, here is another violation of the standard account and its claims that we spent 95% of our history in small bands, and that any scaling up beyond this would lead to hierarchy, all of which they falsify with numerous examples of monumental architecture that small bands could not possibly create. The most spectacular being the mammoth houses of the Ukraine, great wooden enclosures to commemorate the mammoth hunt, the massive earthworks of Poverty Point in today's Louisiana, which they describe as a place of crowds, power, geometric achievement and esoteric knowledge, and most spectacular of all, the immense megalithic enclosures of Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, where 20 massive megalithic enclosures are supported by 200 pillars, each a unique work of sculpture. And in all of these, like the earthworks of Hopewell, major levels of synchronized effort, knowledge and skill were utilized, all without the usual trappings of centralized power. And turning now to the play farming and lost cities of the Neolithic, here we have still more violations of the standard account. where the world's oldest town, Catalhulk, in today's Turkey, dating from about 7,400 BCE and populated by thousands of people for about 1,500 years, which had all the knowledge and the techniques for farming and was once thought to be among the first major populations to practice agriculture, but which is now recognised as choosing stubbornly to remain primarily in the worlds of hunting and foraging, in what Graeber and Wengrow describe as an act of cultural refusal and as part of a conscious decision to keep intact a certain sort of society, rejecting full-scale, serious agriculture to become instead one of the world's first play farmers, dabbling and experimenting in cultivation, but in such a way as to be consciously designed not to be a single point of sustenance, but rather as a secondary supplement to a wider food web from multiple sources. And far from the image of new agricultural servitude, here is something decidedly more relaxed, farming as a form of coaxing from nature what could be coaxed and letting it do most of the work in tangled house gardens, temporary habitats and garden plots of low-level food production, which it turns out was characteristic of most of the early cultivators in the Fertile Crescent, as well as across Mesoamerica and Amazonia. And here is also the Davids tell us explanation for the missing 3,000 years that it took for agriculture to take hold of human society when all the knowledge and the techniques were there to do so. And it's also where we find Graeber and Wengrow giving our species its due, presenting them as far from passive recipients of insistent and unstoppable agriculture, and more as conscious and strategic actors making informed decisions as to how securing food balances with their ideals for society and a way of life. And what can be said of farming is equally true of cities. So that as science now extends further into the past, we now know that cities existed for at least 3 millennia earlier than orthodoxy has it, first appearing around 6,000 years ago. But despite their scale and their density of population, these weren't recognised as cities because they lacked the supposed signatures of a true city, namely hierarchy, monumental architecture, and monopolies of wealth and power. Cities such as the mega sites of the Ukraine, where over 1,000 settlements organised in great concentric rings were inhabited for 8 centuries from about 4,100 BCE onwards, without officials or monuments, and with an economy based on what the Davids call play farming on a grand scale, remarkable in its diversity and able to sustain thousands of people without much in the way of either hierarchy or conflict. Or, equally, in the newly discovered earliest Mesopotamian cities of the 4th and the early 3rd millennium BCE, revealing how Mesopotamia was never the eternal land of kings, and whose first cities were homes not to monarchs or aristocratic warriors, but places of democratic participation, such that Graeber and Wengrow argue that it's almost impossible to find a city anywhere in the ancient Near East which did not have the equivalent of a popular assembly, often several different ones, representing such things as the interests of the young or the interests of the old, and in which women often participated. And then there's the great city of Teotihuacan, founded around 100 BCE, and whose grandeur and sophistication was on par with imperial Rome, and whose destiny looked to be that of the classic Mesoamerican city, that is to say, a city of warrior aristocrats, concentrated power, monumental art and ritual killing, but which in AD 300 suddenly chose a different path, abandoning pyramids and killing for a collective, self-consciously egalitarian politics, devoted to diverting its wealth and power into the provision of excellent stone-built housing in what surely must be the world's first welfare state. And finally, in their efforts to better understand these places of scale and complexity, Graeber and Wengrow return to some of the classic ideas of older social anthropology in their attempt to find new ways to think about our past, and in particular the ideas of schismogenesis and seasonality, the first of which, schismogenesis, refers to the way that people come to define themselves in comparison to their neighbours, each defining itself against the other in a common system of differences, defining who we are by what we are not, in cultures, they say, of self-conscious refusal, where decisions whether to adopt, say, agriculture are as much about how we should live and what kind of people we should be. And the David's chief exemplar of this, and one that rivals conventional history's favourite example of Athens and Sparta, are the peoples of California and their neighbours in the Canadian northwest coast, which for centuries before the coming of Columbus was home to hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of inhabitants, the majority living in these neighbouring societies, both of whom interestingly rejected agriculture, but were at the same time schismogenic opposites, with the people of the Canadian Northwest adopting an heroic culture of slavery, potlatch, greased-fest gluttony, boastful extravagance, externality, theatricality, masks, illusions, facades, and trickery, while the Californians were a society of sweat lodge leanness, inner self-discipline, hard work, interiority, introspection, spirituality, and austere simplicity. And in this, I think we can see how Graeber and Wengrow want ideas that help move our idea of history away from the irresistible forces of big picture history such as agriculture and back to the decisions and the priorities of human societies. And in this regard, perhaps the concept most central to their project to restore agency to the peoples of the past is not schismogenesis, but seasonality, an idea first developed by the great anthropologists Claude Lévi-Strauss and Marcel Mauss in their respective studies of the Nambukara and the Inuit, both of whose societies gathered in concentrated settlement in one time of the year, only to disperse into foraging bands in another, and in doing so adopting, in effect, two parallel societies, each with their own distinct systems of law, religion and social structure. In the case of the Inuit, living under the coercive, sometimes even tyrannical power of patriarchs in the summer hunt, only to return in the winter to a collective life of equality, altruism and the sharing of wealth, and even of husbands and wives, in a way of life practiced across the whole of the pre-modern world, from the builders of Stonehenge through to Amazonia and to the indigenous societies of the American Great Plains. And all of them doing so in completely varied ways, with some crystallising into hierarchy in the winter rather than the summer, with some egalitarian all year round but alternating in a ritual order first dominated by men and then dominated by women, and in some where people would adopt even different names, literally becoming someone else depending on the time of year. And again, it's in this capacity to move from one social arrangement to another that Graeber and Wengrow find the political sophistication of the pre-moderns, enabling them to see social arrangements not simply as given, but open to human intervention, with calculating politicians forced to manoeuvre in societies designed to ensure that nobody could exercise power over others, in what Murray Bookchin calls an ecology of freedom, where human beings for most of our history moved back and forth between different social arrangements, breaking apart and reassembling societies in different ways and at different scales, assembling and dismantling hierarchies on a regular basis in seasonal laboratories of social possibility and political self-consciousness. Which I think is a suitable place to conclude this first of 3 films on the dawn of everything, a manifesto of a book that seeks to dismantle the old historical orthodoxy, restore agency to the pre-moderns, and re-envision human possibility, and whose rethinking of history is matched by a rethinking of politics, which will be the topic of the next film.